I'd like to welcome Michael Kramer and to do his introductions.
Thank you, Lynn Ann, and thanks again to CPD for your assistance with the webinar series. Welcome everyone to the third of our four webinars in the SUNY Historians Network pilot series in U.S. history, funded by an IITG and an Innovative Instructional Technology grant. This webinar is organized by the SUNY History Lab, which is based at SUNY Brockport, where I'm a professor of history. And the webinar series is intended to foster scholarly exchange among faculty and students across campuses in the SUNY system, our very decentralized system, I should say. So we're trying to connect across campuses around historical inquiry. So glad you can join us tonight. We have a wonderful session. Before I introduce our three presenters, let me just tell you a little bit of how these sessions have worked and a preview of our final spring session coming up in June. So the webinars generally work with our presentations followed by discussion, kind of like a conference panel or a seminar. And we generally use the Q&A function. So if you have questions, you can use the Q&A function to frame your question. In the discussion, we can easily unmute you to have you ask your question if you prefer, or if you're feeling shy, I, as the moderator, can read your question for you. So you can indicate that in the Q&A when you ask your question. Please use the Q&A function instead of the chat function. We have one more seminar coming up in June, on June 6th. Dr. Corey A. Graves in the SUNY Albany Department of History will be presenting on her research for a presentation called The Abortion Menace, African Americans and Abortion, 1950 to 1972. So that will be from 4 p.m. to 6 p.m. on June 6th, about just over a month from now. If you're interested in registering for the series or for our final webinar, I've put a link in the chat where you can find the CPD page and register there. If you're interested in joining the mailing list for SUNY History Lab and for the webinar series, you can do so at the SUNY History Lab website, which is also linked from the chat, or you can just email me at mkramer@brockport.edu. I should also say that we're hoping to continue the series into next year. And if you're interested in presenting on research, teaching, a topical roundtable, anything that you might be interested in, please contact me, and I'm glad to work with you to see if it can fit into our series next year. So we really encourage others to present, share research, and build, as the jargon goes, a community of practice of scholarship across the SUNY system around history and historical inquiry. Okay, we're delighted to have these three marvelous scholars here for a session tonight about multiple methods for Haudenosaunee history. We have Dr. Montgomery Hill, Monty Hill, from the Department of Indigenous Studies at SUNY Buffalo, Dr. Maeve Kane from the Department of History at Albany, and we have Dr. Michael Oberg from the Department of History at SUNY Geneseo. I'm going to introduce the three of them and tell you about them, and then I will hand it over to Dr. Hill to begin the presentations, followed by our conversation. Dr. Montgomery Hill is an assistant professor in the Indigenous Studies Department at SUNY University at Buffalo and a citizen of the Tuscarora Nation Beaver Clan. His research looks at Indigenous languages, indigeneity on a global scale, as well as exploring and creating relations between Indigenous and non-Indigenous individuals, communities, and systems of thought. Beyond the academic world, he's engaged in community work as ceremonial custodian. He was also awarded a Luce Indigenous Knowledge Fellowship for his work on translation and the Haudenosaunee Great Law of Peace, a project which integrates Indigenous knowledge with linguistic analysis. Currently, he is writing a monograph entitled Making Tuscarora, Life, Death, and Language, about his experiences in language revitalization as a student, teacher, and language activist. His work has been supported by the American Philosophical Society and the Humanities Institute at SUNY University at Buffalo. Dr. Maeve Kane is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University at Albany. Her first book, Shirts Powdered Red, Haudenosaunee Gender, Trade, and Exchange Across 3 Centuries, was published with Cornell University Press and uses digital social network analysis, material culture, and indigenous studies methods to argue that Haudenosaunee women used clothing to protect their nation's sovereignty. She is the co-author of a new textbook on American women's history, in addition to several articles on material culture and indigenous history. And her current project examines how objects are used to express ideas about race, gender, and nationhood in commemorations of the American Revolution. Her work has been supported by the Mellon Foundation, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the New York Historical Society, and the New York State Archives, and she is recipient of the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. Dr. Michael Leroy Oberg is Distinguished Professor of History at SUNY Geneseo and founder of the Geneseo Center for Local and Municipal History, which he directed from 2019 until 2022. He has written the textbook Native America, now in its 3rd edition with Wiley Blackwell, and the following works: Dominion and Civility, English Imperialism and Native America, 1585 to 1685, published with Cornell University Press. Uncas, First of the Mohegans, from Cornell University Press as well. Samuel Wiseman's Book of Record, the official account of Bacon's Rebellion in Virginia, published by Lexington Books. The Head in Edward Nugent's Hand, Roanoke's Forgotten Indians, published by University of Pennsylvania Press. The 1st edition of Native America, the aforementioned textbook, Professional Indian, Eliezer Williams' American Odyssey, also by University of Pennsylvania Press, and Peacemakers, the Iroquois, the United States, and the Treaty of Canandaigua, 1794, published by Oxford University Press. He has published as well articles and reviews and has worked as a historical consultant for Native communities in New York and North Carolina, as well as for the Indian Resources section of the United States Department of Justice. He has won awards for his teaching and research in Montana and in New York, including also the SUNY Chancellor's Award for Excellence in Teaching. We're delighted to have these 3 wonderful scholars with us tonight, and I'm going to hand it over first to Dr. Montgomery Hill, and we'll followed by the other presentations, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Welcome and enjoy tonight's event.
All right. Now, thank you, Michael. Dr. Montgomery Hill, Gyathe, Skarure, Diwagak Nutne, Disne Junaka Gisaseta. Bagatineti, Hane, Waiguahuye, Hana Gane, Nagaye, Hesa Queni, Neguita Natni, Nakaniki Riwakia. Had to Hesna one there, Neguita Caneti, had to wit it when they were here. So, hi, yeah, I'm Dr. Montgomery Hill. I am very thankful that I was asked to come here and give a talk on my current research here. I'm a member of the Tuscarora Nation Beaver Clan, and like they said, I'm an assistant professor here in Indigenous Studies. Previously, my PhD is in linguistics, and with a focus on linguistics, and that's sort of my primary interest. So I was really happy to be invited here to sort of like see what a historical perspective gives us with respect to Indigenous language revitalization, and specifically my language. And I'm sort of situating that in the context. Let's see, is that which PDF? Oops. Nope, that's the wrong one. Okay, that one, this one. All right. There we go. Okay. Yeah, so the proper slide here. Yeah, so making language, that's sort of like one of the interesting terms that I've come across recently in terms of sort of understanding what language revitalization is, understanding what it's trying to do is restore agency, and this sort of idea of this creation without necessarily going back to tradition, but building upon it and moving it forward. And so my original talk had been, well, my talk is still called Genres of Documentation, but I consider this looking at documentation a way of understanding making language. And so what we see, as we'll see in a second, is that language is shaped not only by the people that are speaking it, but also by the people that are looking at it. And so one of the things that we're moving forward is to understand like how this happens and what that really looks like. So yeah, I'm really thankful. I'm just finishing up my second year here at University of Buffalo, and I've been really happy to be involved. So, all right, moving on. All right, so today, brief agenda here. I want to just do a brief introduction, personal introduction, talk about myself, talk about my relationship to my community. And then after that, I'll get right into the good stuff with documentation, linguistics, and history. Talking about the history of the Tuscarora language. It's not necessarily a very well-known language compared to Seneca and Mohawk. There's far less speakers. But we're doing pretty well for ourselves, I would say, as Tuscarora people. And Haudenosaunee language revitalization more generally, I think is very impressive in the state that it currently is. I'm also interested in looking at sort of like language revitalization as a problem of periodization in terms of history. So one of the things is that there's a lot of discussion in the field about how we talk about endangered languages or dying languages or extinct language, so on and so forth. And there's a lot of, I guess, like getting caught up in the taxonomy, how we choose to label these things, or even where we decide to like draw the lines, right, about where a certain kind of language is ending and a certain kind of language is beginning. And when we really look at this, those boundaries kind of start to fall apart. So one of the things I've been looking at is for good objective guideposts that we can all sort of agree on when it comes to like understanding how language just changes over time, right? The idea is that language is always constantly in this state of flux, and language revitalization, the stuff going on with that, is just another one of these particular states that language happens to be in. It just happens to be a new state that we really haven't, it's a unique moment in the history of language, really, because this is the first time we really have like this big documentation effort going on about this pushback against language shift engendered by colonization and engendered by linguistic hegemony by the empire, right? And so we're going to look at that, and then also just look at what documentation has to tell us. So to introduce myself here, so I'm Dr. Hill. The Tuscarora Nation is located over here, Tuscarora Nation territory. I grew up here. I went to elementary school here. I've been learning Tuscarora since pre-K, actually, is where they introduced that, especially with the Ganonyok or the Ganahara Tetra, the Thanksgiving address into our school. And that has been like a really serious, made a really serious impact on me. So part of the reason that why I'm here now. And so my research really is based on this connection to the community that was forged back then. And I have always sort of been looking at ways to connect the positive experiences I have with Haudenosaunee language and culture and make that more available to everybody else. So this linguistic research, this historical research, I think is one way of doing that, raising awareness and helping people build connection. Like I said before, I'm at the SUNY University of Buffalo, just started there 2 years ago. I'm very happy to be in our Indigenous Studies department. I received my PhD in linguistics from there in 2020 with my advisor, Karen Michelson, who worked on the Oneida language. I was very thankful for her guidance and patience, really. There's a lot, because as you know, like we can definitely understand linguistics as a science of imperialism. So as a Haudenosaunee person, I have feelings about that, and she was willing to work with me about all of these particular things and turn it into something productive. I figured out a way, I think, to be both a good linguist and both a good linguist and a good Indigenous person at the same time, which requires a lot of balance, I think, and a lot of thoughtfulness. In this broader picture, I've been really super interested in this decade of Indigenous languages. So for those who may not have known, in 2019, the United Nations passed a resolution indicating that year was to be the year of Indigenous languages. And we quickly realized, it was quickly realized that Indigenous languages in the state that they're in need more than a year. So what it was is it was decided that from the years 2022 to 2032 is the decade of Indigenous languages. And there's been a lot of effort being put into that, raising awareness, so on and so forth. So I consider my work to be sort of like situated within this larger picture. On top of that, personally, I am working on this book project, sort of talking about my experiences in language revitalization. Like I said, bringing back this idea of making language, and not in like a conlang sense, not in the sense like the languages they make up for Game of Thrones or Avatar, but like how do we make our languages? How do we make our culture for our people? What does that look like, and how do we share it? How do we bring agency back into our speech communities? Okay. So that's my personal introduction there. You kind of get an idea of where everything's going on. One of the neat things, I was actually just at a conference, the workshop for structure and constituency of the languages of the Americas over in University of Toronto. And we have representatives from almost all of our Haudenosaunee communities. And a lot of our communities now are actually supporting and putting through a lot of graduates in adult language immersion programs, which has been shown, at least for our languages, to be the most effective way for promoting the acquisition and growth of our languages. And it was just really impressive and inspiring. So I just wanted to give a shout out to that. So one of the things, I'm going to start off with giving a history of the Tuscarora language as far as I understand it. One of the things I actually want to start off with, this is a map from a dissertation from Douglas Boyce, I believe, in UNC. And what you see here is typically what I hear very often is that North Carolina is the homeland of the Tuscarora people. Now, this is only partially true, in as much as, yes, at the time of contact, Tuscarora people were in fact located in North Carolina at that point. But from our historical understanding, we know that Iroquoian languages, we look at where the Cherokees are right now in Kentucky, sort of like Western North Carolina. We are Iroquoian languages, and the ones that are being spoken now are actually very somewhat closely related to Cherokee. And so for me, a complete understanding of the story kind of reflects that rather than just being in North Carolina, but looking at our oral history, understanding that and putting that together with our linguistic understanding of what's going on. It was also the case that my Tuscarora ancestors were in fact living up here in New York State for quite some time, and at some point migrated down to North Carolina, and then sometime pretty far pre-contact. And then, we were there situated during contact, were pushed out with the arrival of the colonists and the shift of power going down there in North Carolina, and so returned up. This also had a really significant impact on our language, as you might imagine, to the point where we had, because of like this massive population that kind of got squeezed together, so we grabbed all the Tuscarora people we could from North Carolina, brought them back up. And what you see like remnants of this in our Tuscarora language communities, where you have people in literally like one block separated from each other, speaking almost entirely different dialects. And this is because historically, right, they would have been located miles away from each other down in North Carolina, or alternatively, on the way up, we also had adopted a lot of other Iroquois speaking people, other people married in to our community, so on and so forth, and they were using our language in productive ways. But that also means that our sort of language, more than just bifurcated, it really just became really highly variant in like this really dense area. So understanding that and trying to deal with that, rather than looking at it from a synchronic perspective of trying to understand like all these complexities, it's just like, it's a matter of what happens when you squeeze a population that was down to like, was up to like 20,000 around there at some point, down to a couple hundred, and you put us in a maybe like a 10 square mile area. And so you get a lot of language shift, a lot of stuff happens on top of the, the social upheaval, the social instability, the political instability, and so on, the fight for survival, ultimately. And one of those fights, I think, was the fight for language. So moving on, trajectory. Yeah, so that's a trajectory of our language. It's a rough outline. So what I have here is I have like a some sort of form of periodization. This is a sort of a way of looking at our language that I more or less inherited from my mentors at the language program there, because first of all, I was not alive in the 70s to see what was going on, but fortunately we have plenty of people there that have firsthand knowledge of what's going on, what the experience was for language speakers. And what we know for sure, in from like 1879 to when I believe that the last Tuscarora person that was in boarding school was released, however you want to understand that, in 1960. And what we see over here actually is a picture of my great-great-grandmother, Clara Miller, who was attending Carlisle, a little early 1900s is when I believe she graduated there, was able to get out of there basically. But that you know, she wasn't the only Tuscarora woman. She wasn't the only Tuscarora speaking woman that went to the school. It affected I would say most, if not all of our families in our communities were touched by this, if not the entire Haudenosaunee language speech community as a whole. Obviously, what we see there is there's a lot of language denigration. The speaking of the language was discouraged in many contexts. By that time, my community had largely become like Christian, and we're doing sort of like not really practicing any sort of traditional Haudenosaunee practices. However, what is interesting is that in this church context, even we have a lot of documentation where the use of a language was encouraged. So we have catechisms, we have hymns, we have so on in the Tuscarora language, which I think is it's something that should be valued. I think it's better than nothing, and I think it's really good data. And ultimately, it shows us where we were, and what we were doing at that particular point in time. Around the same time, 1954, we also had the Tuscarora Indian School built on our territory. At that point, the language wasn't really being recognized by New York State as like a legitimate subject of instruction. However, we did have language classes being offered by fluent speakers, just for people that were interested in acquiring the language and picking that up. 1970s through 1980s, what we have here is it's characterized by this is like our first solid count of actual Tuscarora speakers. Historically, what would happen, the counts were given, it was either you could speak English or you weren't speaking English is the primary counts that we have for the data for our language. So we know we had like a sizable population of Onondaga living with us, for example. So when we look at the data for the speech data that was collected in some of the reports earlier on, we don't necessarily have the fine-grained detail to understand who actually was and wasn't speaking Tuscarora at the time. So in the 1970s, when we had a lot more linguists actually paying attention to our community and what was going on, it was assessed that we had 52 fluent speakers living in the U.S. and Canada. So the main bodies of Tuscarora speakers would be in 6 nations. Would be the Canadian body, and in my community, we also had a significant body of speakers. It was noted even then, and I'm going to spare everybody like the linguistic details, but there was a significant dialect difference even back then, and that as the speaker number decreased, the difference in dialects becomes starker because there's just less data, there's less people, and you sort of have to navigate these very these idiolectical differences, the way that people speak. So what we see, so people are at that point, from what I understand, from what I hear, people were unconcerned about the loss of the language simply because they knew that there was X many people still speaking it. And these people were doing their best to pass these languages along. In the 70s, we had the language being made available in the high school classes, and it's been, in the 80s, it was expanded even to the pre-K and 6th grade. Later on in the it got cut off here, but this says 1990s. We had a lot more attention given to our language. Interestingly enough, there was a lot of interest in bringing back traditional like Haudenosaunee practices during this time as well. Like, so I remember being in the elementary school at this time, and when they introduced the redoing the Thanksgiving address at the beginning and end of the week. And that was a very powerful experience. It was based on a model that I believe that they were already doing in the elementary schools for the Seneca in the Iguanda, I believe, is where one of the places that had started. And the person that actually brought this Thanksgiving address into our community, into our school like this, was a graduate of the University of Buffalo American Studies program. So it's really cool that we have this full-on cycle, right? And like one of our things is in Haudenosaunee principles, right? We're always looking for the 7 generations, and we're seeing, I'm seeing the work behind me that everybody's done, and I'm happy to be here carrying that forward and passing it on. So it's just a really beautiful experience to be part of. Unfortunately, at the same time, the number of speakers in the 1990s went way down. It was just, we were just in a mode of basically entirely attrition. Although like, people did value the language, people still value this language today as like a serious part of their identity. It wasn't being taught or transmitted effectively, is I guess that's how I would phrase it. Although at the same time, we could be thankful also that there were cultural and language positions being supported at the Tuscarora Indian School there on the territory. So in that sense, even though we might not have like the most effective methods at the time, we still had our foot in the door, and we were still planting the seed of the importance of this language and giving access to actually basic literacy skills in the language, which is hugely important. We're still having adult language learners. There's a bunch of fun. We're actually I'm really thankful for this, because a lot of the people that were attending these language classes were very thorough in keeping like personal notebooks, and a lot of them have actually handed in these notebooks to our language program, which we now have access to. So we know a lot of the stuff actually that people were interested in talking about during this particular time, and we have a lot of like really interesting vocabulary that shows up. Moving on, primary school, right? So like I said, started pre-K in 1995, and that was being consistently exposed to the language. We were exposed to fluent speakers, so we did have that sort of acculturation, this linguistic acculturation that was happening from a young age, but I think is invaluable, really an irreplaceable experience. At that time, also, we had our dictionary published, which was an amazing resource, to the point where our fluent speakers regularly consulted this dictionary the same way that we do as English speakers. So we're thankful for that, for that work that was being produced. Another example of language documentation, kind of showing what is happening in the language community. In the 2000s, we go down to less than 2,000 speakers, or 10 speakers. We're basically down at this point to one primary elder that's working with us, Howard Rayetus Hilgahan, and who passed it, and we'll get to that in a minute. But it was really, he contributed a lot to our language efforts during this time. And we also noticed during this particular period of time that there's a lot of people that are interested in volunteering, putting their effort into the language program. One of the things that was started was the NEST program that was sort of inspired by the Hawaiian language NEST, to a lesser degree, but it was still available. And one of the things that we also made a point of doing is, from this point onwards, any family, any woman really that was having a child on our territory, we were able to give them this, what we call the basket of beginnings, so that they were able to have language that they could use with their child from birth, which I think is a very powerful experience, helps build community, and shows a way of like building language together with culture, together like modern, I guess like community building practices, I guess I would say. We also got interested, this is around the same time, I'll talk about this a little bit more as well, that the Ongoanaganjokwa Mohawk Immersion program over in Six Nations started. And today, we understand that model today to be the most effective model of creating new speakers of Haudenosaunee languages. So that was a really important benchmark for us at OC. So 2010 to 2018, this is also sort of like roughly coincides with my my dissertation, my doctoral studies as well. I started at UB in 2011, and we were able to pretty consistently be working with Howdy Gehan up through 2018, and he passed in 2018. He passed, and he was working with us. Well, he was up until the point where he passed away. Like he had he had the dictionary with him next to his hospice bed. That's the point he was really working with us. He gave us the name for our language program, the Niego Witathquaseg Tuscarora language program. Niego Witathquaseg in our language means that we will be the ones carrying on the language. So that was the sort of responsibility. It feels like he sort of like christened us with, sort of gave us this responsibility, passed it on, made this transition in a really powerful way. And we also started working with Onkwana very seriously at this point, including having a number of our Tuscarora speakers going in and learning Mohawk. So we actually, most of the people learning Tuscarora today are also bilingual Mohawk. I would say maybe about half of the L2 speakers that we have right now are bilingual Mohawk, bilingual Tuscarora. But that's been a really fun experience, and especially, you know, when we consider that, like I think about my dad's mother, before she went to the mush hole, it was known that she was able to speak Mohawk and Tuscarora and Cayuga. So Haudenosaunee multilingualism is actually very traditional and only something that only recently went away. So that's something that I like to remind people, especially with this idea. Sometimes we get this idea in their heads like, oh, I'm Tuscarora, so I should only be learning Tuscarora. I'm Seneca, so I should only be learning Seneca. No, that's not really how it used to be. But it is difficult, I think, nowadays to sort of involve yourself in all these different speech communities. What else did it? I think there's a lot going on. Yeah, so I mean, it was a big loss. And one of the reasons this sort of period is important is if you actually go look on our Wikipedia page, I'm currently in a Wikipedia edit war where there is well, if you use current linguistic criteria, in 2018, when Howdy passed, that is when our language went extinct, which I think is a really interesting idea, given the fact that Howdy himself was like, okay, well, you guys are now the new speakers. You guys are now the new ones entrusted with carrying on the language. And so to me, when you look at this, there's definitely some we need to work on our criteria for periodization there, especially as linguists. And I think taking this long view historical perspective is actually really useful in this particular case to show that, you know, our language has always been in a state of flux. It's always been changing, and to sort of like situate ourselves beyond just like this immediate future that's focused on, I mean, this like grievous presence that's focused on loss. The idea is to take a wider view of that. So what we have going on through today, 2019 and onwards, we have actually established the Nego Itathquaseg as like a formal language program. We have a 501c3 that supports it, along with our NEST program. We provide instruction to our language elementary school teachers. And also, amazingly, we have Tuscarora classes and Haudenosaunee language and culture classes being made available at the Niagara University and SUNY University at Buffalo. There's also been, like, you know, other Seneca language classes going on in other universities. I know also like Six Nations Polytech offers classes in Onondaga and Cayuga. So all our language teaching in this high degree has been proliferating in our educational institutions. And it's been a really amazing experience to see, because together with that basket of beginnings, we actually are able to now provide a child from birth education in at least access to the Tuscarora language in their education from before pre-K all the way up through secondary education, which to me indicates, you know, this is a growing language. This isn't something that's extinct. This is not something that we're letting go. This is not something that is going to be stopping anytime soon. So that is where we are today. Future plans. Ideally, we would like to move that nest into a full-time immersion daycare. We would like to start building multiple cohorts of our adult immersion classes. Right now, we are on our second year of adult immersion. Our second cohort of adult immersion students, which means we have about 12 learners now that have been through our adult immersion program that have reached like an intermediate to advanced low level of proficiency according to the Actifil system, which has been just a really impressive thing to see. Yeah, it's been really cool, and we have some other ideas too, like building a language house to give people, our speakers, the opportunity to live together and to use our language together in a way that's easy and accessible, I suppose. To reduce all the friction that comes with the use of our language. So now we have a couple groups here, just a couple pictures here. We started doing language camps, so that has been pretty effective over the summer. It's been like, I guess, like a PR tool, but it also serves as like this really effective way. Even though we're not necessarily building fluency per se during these language camps, we're able to identify students with high aptitude for the language during this period of time. And actually from there, we've managed to recruit a number of students that had there not been the language camp, we actually wouldn't have even known that they were interested or so able in the language, because not every Tuscarora person is necessarily attending our elementary school or middle school and so on. We have community members all over the place. So giving them a chance to sort of connect with our community has been a really valuable and worthwhile experience. So now what I'm interested in, I'll talk about, so that's like our history, our documentation, and the way that we say it. One of the cool things, one of my favorite things about the Tuscarora language is that our language has been the object of study of an object of record since John Lawson in 1609, and arguably maybe before that. One of our scholars, Blair Rudsgahan, has some other records that might go a little bit earlier, but we can't really say whether it's Tuscarora or not. But I like this. I like looking at our linguistic documentation, because a lot of the time when you're looking at linguistic documentation, it tells a bigger story than just what the language looked like. So when you look there, we're seeing here, this is actually, from John Lawson's text. I think it's called Voyages to North, like a record of voyages to North Carolina. So he was in North Carolina around then. And what he says in here, right? He says that the Tuscaroras are the most numerous in North Carolina, and therefore their tongue is understood by some in every town of all the Indians near us. And here I shall insert a small dictionary of every tongue, although not alphabetically digested. So there's a lot of interesting vocabulary that shows up. Interestingly enough, most of the vocabulary here is actually still very close to what we say today, although we have to sort of like make accommodations for the fact that this was written by a speaker of the English language, and then the rules of literacy back then were very different. They weren't necessarily standardized. People were basically working with the best that they can. However, you can still recognize actually a lot of the words here in our word list. So our word for one, it says like unchi here. Our word for one is still anchi. Our word for two is still nakti. Our word for three is still asa. Our word for four is hintduk, which you can kind of, you have to like squint your ears a little bit. I'm not sure how else to explain what's going on, but whisk, uhyuk, so huyuk, right? Jotnak, nekre. So what we see is actually this like really interesting consistency. And what we're also seeing is that this language has just been represented in a various number of ways from the beginning. Although we see that the language itself, the sort of like core of it, the spirit of it is still there and accessible in these documentations. That's from 1609. There were some other scholars in the meantime, but I wasn't able to get any sort of visuals on the sort of records that they left in a way that was like, I guess, sort of valuable for this conversation at the moment. So the next largest sort of body of work documenting our language originated with J.M.B. Hewitt, who actually was a Tuscarora man that worked with the Bureau of American Ethnology, Erminie A. Smith, in the late 1800s. And he was very meticulous and captured a lot of it was all written, the stuff that he captured of the language. And he left very useful notes in here, including noting things like this idea that even back then, so even in like the 1800s, late 1800s, when he was recording things, there were some certain words in our dialect that were considered archaic, even at that point, even though they were still in use. One of the important things is this is actually a really important word that even shows up in our tellings of the Great Law of Peace, where they talk about, okay, Ruri Insa, he has a father, and what you'll say is, well, in Mohawk, you'll say Yate Honi-san. When you're talking about the peacemaker, you're saying the one that doesn't have a father. And that's the same sort of verb that we have going on here. So we can see that even though, we weren't necessarily talking about the peacemaker or this particular source of relationships in Tuscarora, our nation wasn't up there when the Confederacy was formed. We still have the shared vocabulary with lists. We still have the same ability to talk about these very culturally important things. He was also very thorough. The only unfortunate thing about this is that the style at the time was to use the third person, the masculine, for all of these sort of inflections, for like dictionary definitions and everything like that. And unfortunately, for Tuscarora, the masculine inflection is actually the least informative inflection that could be used. So we don't know, for example, this RU is this masculine prefix here, and it's the same, it's almost the same no matter what sort of inflectional class that these verbs belong in. So we're not able to use any sort of like masculine inflected examples to sort of deduce other word forms, unfortunately. So that is also one of the unfortunate things that be going on. But the rest of the data is good, but it's just sort of like something that we have to work with, something that we've learned our lesson in. So one of the interesting things that we've had to do is decide, okay, well, we're not going to collect all 15 forms of the verb for every single verb. I mean, even through here, like, so there would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There would be 6 times 15, 90? That would give us 90 verbs just from here if you were to write out the whole inflectional system of. So the idea is, right, with our complicated inflectional system, you only want to do as little as possible. You want to do as little as possible and record the one that's most informative. So in most cases, that's actually the first person form or the third person feminine indefinite. I'm not sure if we'll see any of that, but that's sort of the idea. Is we're kind of like also struggling against cultural history as well, right? Because this sort of use of the masculine prefix, that was convention at the time. Marianne Methuen later, yeah, I mean, there's like some other stuff that went on in between there, but this would be like the next biggest jump. 1976, Mary was written the grammar of Tuscarora. Marianne Methuen was a student of Floyd Lounsbury, who was one of the first foremost scholars, I think, of Iroquoian languages. He manages to create a really systematic description of our pronominal prefix system, one of the most like complex morphological systems, probably globally, actually, and made a really good visualization of this. And so what we see here is one of his students able to come to our language and start to sort of explain and understand everything that's going on in our words. And then this is, in our words, right? So the idea is that, and I don't know how many of you may have heard this, but like an Iroquoian verb basically has the informational equivalent of a whole English sentence. And so what you are able to see in her grammar is that this all gets spelled out. You get the morphological, like the parsing. So you get like that, I'll get an egg. And so you get that right here, that corresponds. And then you see the indefinite is this A here, first person, I, discover or to know. So you get interesting glosses, right? So somehow you get from I don't know to know, indefinite, first person, discover, perfect. Right. And you had to sort of learn how to, but this idea is, I think it was a really valuable thing, because what you're able to do is when you move it from this sort of particular English form into this more abstract form, you're able to sort of start shedding your English biases and sort of understand like more what they're trying to say in the language itself, and like in these particular kinds of structures. On the other hand, doing this sort of notation is incredibly time consuming, especially when you basically have to have 4 lines of interlinear translation for any of these things to be particularly meaningful. One of the things that we've been doing now that more people have been gaining fluency, and you see this a lot more in Mohawk, is that a lot of the people will just stick to that the first and second line. So you'll just get the plain Tuscarora with the plain English. And that's because we do now have all of these resources available out there for people to access, to look into it, to see if they want to sort of do the decomposition for themselves. They can go and figure out how to do that, rather than putting it up front and making it sort of intimidating and really inaccessible, I think, to a lot of learners that are interested in picking up our language. And even so, we look at our dictionary, which is incredible. It was an incredible resource. It was mostly geared towards, however, both linguists, and when this book was being written, to fluent speakers of the language that didn't have to worry so much about what all of these individual parts of these words mean. So, I mean, and today is a valuable resource, but the point is, I think that even though this is a valuable resource created within the community, it left out a significant body of the community that aren't able to access it, either because they don't have the speaking ability necessary, or they don't have the linguistic training to understand what is going on with all this particular notation, why we're using roots, what these particular abbreviations mean, and how to apply them, and so forth. So it's a very powerful tool, requires training to use, which I think is fine, but we would like to sort of like find this new balance. So right now, this is actually what we see for our Tuscarora language program. This is sort of how we're writing it nowadays. We have a formal linguistic system, orthographic system, fairly conventionalized. We've changed it around a little bit. And again, we're focusing mostly just on complete word forms. So we're not even though we can do the breakdown, the idea is like we leave the breakdowns basically as an exercise to the reader, rather than sort of cluttering the immediate material with them. And in that way, even though it appears like, oh, okay, well, there's less information in here, that's not necessarily true, right? We don't, with all the documentation that's happened in the meantime, we're able to now sort of just provide these more basic less elaborate resources, or more straightforward resources to our learners and everything, in a way that's a little bit more accessible. We also make sure, rather than we like to use a lot of like what we call like Duolingo sentences as well. So it's been shown that like the weirder the sentences are, or like anything sort of like emotional, is also more memorable. So we make a point of like teaching students how to say like, oh, I know him, but I don't like him, right? That's a really, a useful sort of phrase, like these useful sort of concepts going on, or like, I really like food, right? I'm a big fan. So all these sort of different, so this is like our more approach. We have like this approach, rather than trying to put forward the fact of how complicated the language is, we put it forward in the most straightforward way and leave it to people to eventually come to themselves, their own understanding, the structure of the language, which is really how language is actually typically transmitted to, like in the context of a home, you're just learning things by yourself. So that's our current learning strategy. And then today, 2024, I have some text actually. So there's a number of people I'm actually able to text entirely in Tuscarora language. The person I'm texting here, Ruth Nyarnet, Christian Burnham, he is currently our Well, I consider him my mentee, but he's also the teacher, the adult immersion instructor for our language program. So it's been really an amazing experience to be able to, just be able to pick up my phone and text him. What you see here is also we're using kind of like mixed orthography. So I use a little bit more simplified orthography because I really don't like having keyboard apps on my phone. So there's ways to write our language sort of like Mohawk style, I guess, where they don't have any exceptionally, I guess what you call strange or unusual or typically unused in the English context orthography, right? So what you'll see here is like he'll use these question marks here. Those are glottal stops, and that's equivalent to this apostrophe that I use. So they represent the same sound, but they're just different methodologies of representing the same sound. The same thing is true for this lengthener. This middle dot here, that's the same thing as these semicolons. One of the things that's really interesting about our languages is that even though you can actually you can actually write them out with the same alphabet, the same orthography. You can actually look at Julian Charles's dissertation, A History of the Iroquois Languages, and see all these languages written out in like a one single orthography that is shared between them all. I've noticed that there are aesthetic differences employed by our language community to sort of signal that how our languages are different, or that they are different when just by able to being looking at them. So you can actually look at Onondaga, recognize that it is Onondaga. Oneida uses a very distinct orthographic set. Same thing with Mohawk. And like what's interesting in that is like for Mohawk and Onondaga, you get a 97, or Mohawk and Oneida, you have like a 97% vocabulary sharing. So most of their words, except for these very narrow, actually it's like the more common words, like the word for and. In Mohawk, you say like tano, and in Oneida, you say kale, which is pretty, those are very, like distinct sort of sounds there. But they're also the most common one. Like the word and is actually a very high frequency word, no matter what language you use. So what you see is that in the high frequency words is where that 3% difference shows up. That's where the main differences start to show up. The old stuff like whisk, that's like the same across all languages, things like that. So there's that, yeah. So like what we're saying here, whisk judas when it twant duckna chukwasta. So he's asking me like when can we get together and talk? So I say Friday, and like, but now I'm still sort of arranging or coordinating my time. And then he's like, okay, yeah. I will ask you again at that time, when implication being like when I'm done fixing up my schedule. Spring break. So we put some English words in there that are just easier to use, and you'll see even fluent speakers do this, especially when there's things that come up where there might be some sort of ambiguity. Like, for example, our word for bed, room, and period of time, or use this word udakfne. And so if a speaker, for example, there's a really good another example of this, wants to talk about a mattress in particular, which is a kind of bed, they'll use the word mattress rather than using this sort of more ambiguous word just to make things more clear. So even then, like you look at it and English words aren't necessarily dirty words. The important thing is that we're communicating, and if we're communicating using primarily the language, or even like half the language, half English, that's still very good. That's not something that I think should be discouraged. So ultimately, what we find is that language revitalization provides an interesting challenge for periodization and taxonomy. So like at what point do we say, okay, well, that the language that me and Christian are using is like a very different language than the one that John Lawson recorded, and to what extent. And we can compare that with like, okay, well, how hard of a time do we have reading John Lawson's work as English speakers, right? And sort of just keeping this sort of perspective. Just because we might not be able to take or especially John Lawson's handwritten notes, even though we might not be able to take those to like Someone on the street that doesn't have any sort of formal English training, but, you know, has been around in English their whole life, they might not be able to understand it. Does not necessarily mean that John Lawson was not writing in English, right? So what are sort of like our criterion? How do we approach that? There's like a lot of these other sort of like cultural issues too. So, you know, I think even just being designated as being like carriers of the language by one of the last fluent speakers, I think is really indicative that this language has a life just beyond these strict sort of typological criteria. So that's one of the things I'm sort of interested in doing. And that is sort of where I've gotten for today. Thank you everybody for listening, and I'm looking forward to hearing from everybody else.
Thank you, Monty, so much. Next, we have Maeve Kane presenting.
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna get my screen share up here. Thank you. So I find that I'm really glad that we put this roundtable together like that, because I think that note that Dr. Hill just ended on of the question of how do we know when we've moved from one period to another has very much been a factor in my own work. So I'm just going to move past this slide very quickly. My editor told me to do this to put, if you order from my book through the Cornell University Press website, there's a discount code there. My book is a little more expensive than I'd like because there's a lot of images in it. I focus on clothing and material culture as a site of settler kind of pressure to change Haudenosaunee gender and labor norms. And as a consequence, there's a lot of images, some of which I'm going to talk about tonight. So this image is typical of a lot of the images that I work with. This is, I'm an early Americanist. I focus mostly on Haudenosaunee history before 1850. But I wanted to talk a little bit tonight about kind of approaching history generally and what it means to kind of frame a project around the idea of thinking about a descendant community's future instead of only thinking about its past. I'm not Native. I came at this project thinking about this. I was originally trained as an early Americanist, and I was coming out of thinking I would do a project on how women in early America used clothing to kind of think about ideas about gender and race more generally. And I had originally framed this project very early when it was a dissertation as how do white women, free and enslaved Black women, and Native women in New York kind of use clothing as a common site of dialogue. And I got further and further into this project, and I was really struck by this image in particular, because for early Americanists, these kind of generic, general images of Native women are very common. Europeans use them as just kind of decorative effect on a lot of objects. But like specific women, specific Indigenous women are very hard to find. So this one was painted by an unknown artist around 1800. And it's the only image of a specifically Haudenosaunee woman that I know of, and I've been looking for them for almost 20 years. And it's really striking in that absence that we have so much written in the settler archive kind of about generic Indigenous women generally, but they rarely show up as specific individuals. And that is kind of how I think about the connection between the present and the past. Dr. Hill talked about kind of the pressures of periodization of language loss. There's this focus on this grievous history of loss. And I think that we see similar things play out in the early American period that results in that. I don't want to downplay that there absolutely has been like periods of loss and rupture for Indigenous communities, but I think the scholarship for a very long time focused on that to the detriment of many other things, specifically as a tool of colonialism. Especially when thinking about clothing and material culture, or the process of cultural change, beginning with really the foundations of American academic study of Iroquois history. There was a very strong focus on the idea of acculturation or assimilation, of cultural loss, particularly expressed through clothing. So this image that we're looking at here is part of that history, because this image could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. One is in this older mode of these stories of acculturation and loss. This woman is wearing almost entirely things that were bought from a European trader. She's wearing probably a wool blanket that's been decorated with imported silk ribbons. The cotton or linen overdress that she's wearing looks very similar to white women's clothing at the time. The baby's cradle board is probably made with imported silk ribbon and wool as well. And then she's also, the only thing that might not have ever touched European hands is her probably deerskin moccasins down at the bottom. So other scholars have interpreted this image as a story of loss, that there is no longer traditional Haudenosaunee culture, or what has been called traditional Haudenosaunee material culture in this image. But this image, and like the women who wore these things and made these choices to wear things like this in the 17th, 18th, and into the 19th centuries, provoked really profound anxiety from American and earlier British and French settlers. And it provoked this really profound anxiety because they did not perceive this as loss, nor did the Haudenosaunee women who made these choices about what they were wearing. Like you wouldn't mistake this Mohawk woman for an English woman of the same time at the same place, even though they bought materials from the same traders. And in many cases, like literally the same traders. This is, again, very typical of the kinds of documents that I work with. This is from an account book kept by a man named Jealous Fonda just west of Albany. So in this, you can see, like, this is one of the rare glimpses that we can get of these choices that these individual women are making. This is Sewistowa, a Seneca woman. And this is kind of like an itemized credit card receipt where she bought a blanket, she bought some gartering, she bought a shirt and a blanket at a later point. So you can occasionally get these little glimpses of these individual people. And as I was starting to go through these kinds of materials, kind of looking for what does this look like, this landscape where settler women, Indigenous women, enslaved and free Black women are making these purchases. I was really struck by how the scholarship talked about these purchases. Like even now in 2024, there's still occasionally things published that place this emphasis on the story of loss. And I think that, so when Michael asked us to put this together and kind of think about what some of the common threads were, we talked over email about kind of how do you approach the past and what's the framework for the project. So that's kind of the angle that I'm thinking about this tonight. And the way that I approached this project was I was having a really hard time making a narrative out of this. Like I could see something in the documentation that I didn't think was reflected in the scholarship, but I was having a really hard time articulating what that meant. And while I was working on this, I read two things that really struck with me. One was Irving Powless, he's the late Beaver Clan faith keeper of Onondaga Nation. And he wrote in his memoirs, he had the story of the first Dutch treaty with the Onondaga and the Mohawk and Oneida. And in this memoir, in this oral history, he described that at the end of this treaty meeting, the Onondaga said to the Dutch, "When we meet later, you will know us by how we are dressed, for we will be dressed in the laws and traditions of our nation." And Powless related this in his memoir as part of this larger story, that he said that he always wore his ribbon shirt and his silver bolo to tie to court whenever he appeared in U.S. courts, to emphasize that he was also dressed in the laws and traditions of his nation, that he was not a citizen of the United States, he was appearing as a citizen of a sovereign nation. And I also read around the same time, Audra Simpson, who's a Mohawk political scientist. She studies the late 20th century and specifically voting and engagement with settler political systems. And in her study of Haudenosaunee, she wrote that refusal is the language that people use to talk about themselves. And thinking about both of those things in the context of what I was working on, the 17th and 18th century, I think that's part of thinking about how to reframe a project outside of an academic system that has been used to erase sovereignty and erase the continued presence of Indigenous people, part of which the SUNY system itself is implicated in, and I'll touch on that a little bit towards the end of my time here. I think if you reframe the approach as a settler scholar of not the question of how to explain the loss, but how to explain the continuance and survivance of Indigenous nations. It really shifts how we approach a lot of these things. So something like this, Sewistawa's purchases, or the image of the Mohawk woman that I showed you a moment ago, is not a story of loss of traditional culture, however that's defined, and often it's been defined in ways that are impossible to meet, that are kind of a fantasy of the settler academic construct. But how do you explain how people make choices, and how do they kind of respond and talk about themselves? So in going through some of these things, like Sewistawa doesn't show up in any other documentation. She's in this account book. She has an account with Fonda for a few years, and there's so many women like her, and men as well. So when I was looking at this, I was trying to figure out, like, how do I make a story out of this? One of the ways to make a story out of this is, well, what is she saying with this, or what is she refusing? Like that image I showed you just a moment ago of the Mohawk woman, part of that refusal is the refusal to be changed by the colonial pressures. Very similar to what Dr. Hill described with pressures around intergenerational loss of knowledge of language transmission. There's very similar pressures in the 17th and 18th centuries around pressures for women specifically to change their modes of dress, change their modes of labor, because settler powers recognized that women's role in kind of the family transmission of culture and knowledge within Haudenosaunee and other Indigenous communities was a very powerful tool of colonialism that's formalized in the education and boarding school system that Dr. Hill touched on, but that's really present throughout a lot of cultural interactions between settlers and Haudenosaunee people in the 17th and 18th centuries. So thinking about what are women doing in this system, how are they refusing, how are they talking about themselves, is part of kind of reading between the lines in these sort of things. The other part of my work involves not just looking at what was bought, what was done with it, how was it reshaped, and kind of what do the refusals in those places mean, but also how do people build identity out of that. One of kind of the foundational ways that Indigenous studies approaches thinking about identity or community is relational ways of being. What does it mean to relate to others in communities? And taking that to those kinds of fragmentary sources like Sewistawa's account in the Jealous Fonda account book, there's these little fleeting moments in account books and other kinds of sources where these two people who will not show up in any other historical documentation, Sewistawa bought a shirt for her grandson, or another woman bought a blanket for another woman. And those were another one of those moments where I was not sure as a historian, like, how do you make narrative sense of that? What's going on and what does it mean? And I think one of the things it means is this rather messy image. This is a visualization of digital social network analysis. This one is a visualization of a church congregation and the connections made by baptism. So if somebody has a child baptized in a Christian church, they usually have a godmother and a godfather, as well as the birth father and the birth mother. And if you draw lines between those people, what does it look like? It looks like this. Gift networks like the one with account books look fairly similar. And thinking about this is very similar to the image of that Mohawk woman. This church community has been read as evidence of acculturation, but I think, like Dr. Hill described, with Tuscarora language being used for hymns and language preservation happening in that context, there's something similar happening in the 18th century with Mohawk and other Haudenosaunee communities' use of Christian churches as well. And here, one of the things in this congregation specifically is that I think that people were using baptismal ties within the Anglican church here to formalize and make visible in a settler archive ties between clans, because there's very clear patterns of baptism between the Turtle, Wolf, and Bear clans of Mohawk Nation. And those are not visible in the register itself, the minister who was doing these baptisms was not making note of people's clan affiliation. But if you juxtapose the names of the parents and godparents, excuse me, alongside information about clan from other documentary sources for this period, you can see that there's pretty clear patterns of association between the different clans. So it's one of these places where, yes, it's taking place within this Christian church, but it's also an expression of very specifically Mohawk ways of belonging and ways of relating, ways of making a community. So then this brings me back to this image and kind of how this all relates to the long history of the SUNY system itself. This is Kahano Caroline Parker. She was a member of the Seneca Wolf clan, and she attended my university, or what's become SUNY Albany. The academic study of Iroquois history is very tied up in the SUNY system. Lewis Henry Morgan is one of somebody who's thought of as one of the foundational anthropologists, and he got involved with the Parker family and wrote what became the League of the Iroquois, or the League of the Haudenosaunee. And part of that process, he commissioned from Caroline Parker and her mother a set of men's and women's clothing that are still held by the New York State Museum or the New York Education Department. And I think that what Caroline Parker made for Morgan in this collection really specifically speaks to how she was thinking about this long history of what is the story of Seneca Nation, of Haudenosaunee people more broadly, and the pressures of the American state that have attempted to erase it for a very long time. What Caroline Parker is wearing in this image is in some ways similar to that image of the Mohawk woman I showed you earlier, in some ways very different. She's wearing a wool skirt, deerskin moccasins, a cotton overdress, and then a wool blanket over the top of it. And I think she's very deliberately echoing this. This is not something that she wore in her daily life, or most women wore in their daily lives by this point in the 1840s. And Morgan had very specifically asked for the most ancient and traditional customary costume of the Iroquois, the language that he used. And he was actually kind of distressed when he received this, when he received this final delivery of objects from Parker. He actually asked her if she didn't need more money for making another set of objects, because he thought she was going to make them out of silk and velvet, things very similar to what he had commissioned for himself to wear in kind of playing Indian in his secret society of Indians. Because the context of this was that Morgan believed Haudenosaunee culture to be declining, to be going extinct, in kind of similar ways to what Dr. Hill described, with this belief around the continual extinction of Indigenous nations, languages, and cultures. And Parker never really explained what choices she made with this. She was a longtime correspondent of Morgan, and they discussed a lot of things that later show up in his League of the Iroquois, like law, tradition, family naming patterns, etc. But she never really explained this set of clothing that she made. The only explanation that she provided him was a set of receipts for all of the things that she bought, because he had paid for the materials for these. And the one thing that's missing on her receipts for the materials that she bought is the red cotton for the overdress. And I think that she never says this in writing, so this is very speculative. But by the time that Parker made this outfit in 1844, the annuity payments for the Treaty of Canandaigua of 1794 were being paid in red cotton calico. And it's still paid in November of every year, in part in calico. And I think that that's a really symbolic choice. Like, Parker knew where these materials were going to end up. Morgan was very explicit with her. And she was also very clear on kind of her own position with respect to the state of New York. At this time in the 19th century, New York State was pressuring the Seneca and other nations to remove out of New York. There was a series of fraudulent treaties that were kind of pushing on the Seneca land base in contradiction to the Treaty of Canandaigua. And I think the story that Parker tells here in her refusal to articulate it is very clear. She's making a narrative of the historic continuance of Haudenosaunee sovereignty and its continuance into the future. And that part of that is the treaty relationship between the United States and Seneca Nation specifically, as well as the other nations of the Haudenosaunee. And this is bound up into the history of the SUNY system, kind of indirectly, my own institution more directly than others, because Parker's enrollment at what became my institution was a normal school or a teacher's college before it became part of the SUNY system. There was no state funding for what became SUNY Albany until the school agreed to enroll at least 10 Haudenosaunee teachers per year as part of this plan to extinguish Haudenosaunee cultures. The plan for these students, Parker included, was that they would return to their home communities and be part of the loss of language and loss of culture that New York State had planned, that resulted in what Dr. Hill described for us a moment ago. And in the first history of SUNY Albany that was written in 1894, the education of Caroline Parker here and the other early Haudenosaunee students that attended with her was called a failure by the university's first president, specifically because Parker did return to her nation and she did teach, but she became a very strong proponent against removal, to such an extent that she was noted within her lifetime as a very notable activist within New York State. And then this image of her is kind of enshrined within the League of the Iroquois as this kind of snapshot of what traditional Haudenosaunee culture is at that moment, her articulation of that. So that's all a long way of saying, I think that kind of methodologically at the top of my mind in approaching these questions is how does the present speak to the past? How does the past speak to the present? And not isolate those things from each other. This weekend on May 5th is Red Dress Day, which is a commemoration or observance of the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls in the US and Canada. So I just really briefly want to end on this note. There's currently advocacy organizations doing the work around raising the visibility of Indigenous women, Haudenosaunee women right now. Seven Dancers Coalition and Rematriation Magazine are two of them. And I think that both of those organizations do a really nice job of kind of thinking about this long history of what does it mean to think about Haudenosaunee women as a significant part of the story of this region, and kind of respond back to what we're seeing now as the devaluing of those women. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. Thank you, Maeve. Next, we have Michael Oberg, and then we'll turn to conversation after that.
Okay, yeah, thanks, Michael, for putting this talk together. And it's great to have this chance to. And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna speak a little more generally and quite briefly, I think, about some of my thoughts. I'm just in the stages of kind of wrapping up and finishing this book I've been working on for over a decade, A History of the Onondaga Nation. I was trained originally as a colonial historian, early American historian, but I began writing Native American history quite early in the game. And in a lot of the work I've done over the years, and I have less time left in this profession than I've already spent, right? I'm getting towards the downhill slide of this. I've tried to kind of take familiar stories and turn them around and transform them into Indigenous stories. So, it was nice of you, Michael, to mention some of the stuff I've been able to put out over the years. But the biography I did of Uncas, who was a New England Algonquian leader, a Mohegan, to sort of try to put him with this list of founding fathers of 17th century New England, the John Winthrops, the Bradfords, the Masons, and say, well, what does this story look like if we place an Indigenous leader in this pantheon of leaders and put Indigenous leaders at the center of New England story? How does that change things? The book I wrote about Roanoke, called The Head in Edward Nugent's Hand, took and kind of wrestled with the question of what is an event, right? And it made the central event not these bumbling English explorers stumbling ashore in 1584 and 1585 and 1587, but the murder of an Algonquian leader in late June of 1586 sort of made that the central event. So how does this story change when we put an Indigenous event at the center of the story? The book I did on Eleazar Williams, so much of the literature on Indian removal is about Cherokee removal, right? Even in New York State, the learning outcomes in the curriculum teach Cherokee removal. They don't talk anything about Haudenosaunee removal. Oneida, Dr. Hill had the map where you can see the Oneida territory in Green Bay. That didn't just happen naturally. That was a product of a systematic program of Indigenous dispossession that transformed New York into the Empire State, right? So let's put Haudenosaunee removal at the center of the story and place this strange Indigenous figure, Eleazar Williams, at the center of the story and see how that changed things. And with Onondaga, I think I'm trying to do some of the same stuff. I've been working on various projects with Onondaga, really going back to the late 1990s when I moved back to New York. And a dog that snores really loudly just walked into the room. So if you hear something in the background, it's not gas, it's just a dog that snores really loud. So bear with me on that. But I was working sort of at the early stage on when the Onondagas were filed a land claim to recover lands taken illegally by the state of New York. I've done work for the nation on issues related to taxation and tobacco, the tobacco economy, and then really for a series of years working on the Onondaga Lake cleanup. Onondaga, for a time, being the most polluted body of water in North America, at least according to some accounts. And that was an interesting project because I was working and answering to Onondaga Nation, but I was getting paid by Honeywell, the polluter, which gave me really deep pockets to photograph and digitize sources. And so as much as it's nice to go to Albany for research, right? First prize one night in Albany, second prize 2 nights in Albany. I don't have to really travel that much anymore. I was able to digitize and copy all these sources and do all this work. And it struck me in the course of doing a lot of this research that even though with Onondaga, there's a much thinner documentary record than say for the Senecas and the Oneidas, there was still a lot of material one could use to write a book. So I've just completed this manuscript called The Central Fire. I'm waiting to hear from a couple of friends who have yet to get back to me with their thoughts. But what this book is going to be is a social history of one Indigenous community and the people who live there over the course of 500 years. From its emergence throughout the formation of the Iroquois League to its to the present. And it follows a Haudenosaunee town through military invasions, through outbreaks of epidemic disease, through colonial efforts to eradicate the people who live there, to deprive them of their lands, their traditional government, and their culture. And in the course of doing this, it just seemed to me that Onondaga ought to be considered a capital, right? In the same sense that Albany, Boston, New York City, Charleston, Providence dominate narratives of early America, Onondaga really ought to be on that same plane. I think you do the same thing with places like Logstown in Western Pennsylvania. Well, these Indigenous places that become, and Geneseo, of course, where I work, became these centers of, Indigenous politics, diplomacy, commerce that really were as significant in the broader history of Eastern America than as the colonial capitals. So the book's going to tell the story of the formation of the Iroquois League with Onondaga at its geographic, its political, and its spiritual center. It will talk about the considerable diplomatic prowess of the Onondaga Nation, which was, buoyed by powerful and coherent cultural system that allowed Onondaga and their longhouse kin to really extend their influence and assert more power than their numbers would allow one to think. Right? They certainly punched way above their weight. The their adherence to this really powerful and coherent cultural system, the great law of peace and power, it seems to me, allowed them to withstand these crises that afflicted them across the 17th and 18th centuries of again, invasion, disease, dispossession. This is a significant community, right? No European, whether Dutch, French, or English, could ignore Onondaga. No indigenous leader east of the Mississippi from the Carolinas northward could ignore Onondaga. They all knew the way to the central fire of the League, and many of them made trips to Onondaga to engage in diplomacy and discussions of really the fate of the continent. So this was an important place. And look, Onondaga, so many of the stories, some of the big books on Haudenosaunee history, like Richter and Alan Taylor, or Richter and people like that, they end in the colonial period. They don't go much past the American Revolution, and Onondaga's influence it continued past the colonial period. But in a sense, the leaders of Onondaga Nation could contain these forces of colonialism really for only so long, right? New York militia forces burned Onondaga in 1779. Much of the population scattered to the refugee haven outside of British-controlled Fort Niagara, and then from there to Buffalo Creek and Allegheny, Cattaraugus, some to the Tuscarora Reservation, later established near Lewiston. Some of them joined the migration across the Niagara River into Ontario, where an additional League Council fire was kindled that still burns there. But a small number remained in Onondaga. Today's Onondaga, south of what is today Syracuse. They struggled to get by. They faced aggressive state authorities intent on purchasing their land, but slowly over the next several decades after the Revolution, Onondagas began to trickle back. So Onondaga, it survived the trauma of the Revolution. It survived the state's systematic campaign to dispossess them, and they endured as this small rural community just a few miles away from the growing city of Syracuse. They fought during these and subsequent years to preserve their lands, their language, their culture, their systems, a system of government, all of which came under assault. They worked to contain the efforts of missionaries and other outsiders who intruded into the nation territory. They made difficult strategic decisions about how to engage with New York and federal officials, all the while maintaining these long enduring ties to the rest of the Longhouse. Beginning forcefully in the 1920s, where I think we were talking before this gathering started, how was it you, Monty? You're teaching from the Everett report to the present or something, right? But that the Everett report of the 1920s was and the Haudenosaunee response to that is part of this this forceful assertion of Haudenosaunee identity and power in the 1920s, where you see Onondagas and others in the League resisting quite forcefully federal and state policies aimed at their assimilation, their incorporation, their dispossession. They fought tirelessly to defend their sovereign rights and their culture. They, with determination, asserted their nationhood before the United States, and right now before the OAS and the United Nations. And there's always been a mix of success and failure, but the larger accomplishment should not be overlooked, right? If any number of non-native peoples in New York, and and before New York, what became New York, any number of those non-indigenous people had their way, the Onondagas would no longer exist. their language and culture would have been destroyed, their lands would have been taken from them, their system of government would have been dismantled, and their nationhood would have been erased. And they survived that onslaught, right? The central fire still burns at Onondaga. You know, and it seems to me it burns right at the heart of Indigenous America. And look, this is this is a book that's covering 500 years of history. And as a colonial historian, I wrote a lot of things where no one I wrote about was alive. You know, no one was there who I had to talk about. And it's you know, it's a community where, again, there's big gaps in the record, right? We know very little about Onondaga in the first 3/4 of the 19th century, not nearly as much as we'd like. There's records there, but you have far less documentation than you do for Seneca and Oneida, places like that. And what's been the big revelation for me is you know, not only the importance of interviewing people, which I've done with dozens of people over the past 10 years. That's important for sure. There are things, particularly about the 20th century, that I could not have learned anywhere else by doing these interviews. But beyond doing the interviews, I think that and this is a luxury of being a tenured person with lots of time to crank out a book, and I don't have to rush. But just spending time at the place one is writing about is invaluable. It's no longer interviews. It's eating breakfast and just bullshitting and hearing stories and listening to people and asking questions and sharing photographs that I find in newspapers or whatever. And in a sense, if I can find the words for this, right? That these conversations end up being far more valuable than the interviews in a sense, right? Because they flesh out context and personalities in ways that I had never encountered in any of the other work I could do, because it's such a document driven field for the 17th and 18th centuries. I hear these all these stories. So just chatting, just learning and listening to people, I think is really made this a great project. And or it will be, right? It's 260,000 words. I'm probably going to have to cut it down, but one of the things I'm really looking forward to doing is writing the acknowledgments for this book, because this was simply something that could not have been done had I not been allowed to spend so much time out on Onondaga, talking to people, chatting with people, and just hearing their stories. So, I mean, that it's been a real joy in that sense, and I've received welcome and encouragement the whole way along the story, even where I write things that some of the people I talk to don't agree with. There's sort of this respect about how we get to different places. This is what I wanted to talk about with terms of methodology. It's just the importance of being present and being able to be on the ground. And I have the luxury of living, 80 miles from the community I'm writing about. So it's easy for me to get there pretty much any day of the week if I really want to. And that whole experience is really even at this late stage of my career, has really changed how I go about doing work. And it's really been a positive experience. That's all I wanted to talk about. So I'm trying to keep it brief, and I'm happy to field any questions. I know that Monty and Maeve's talks will generate some questions too. So I'm curious to hear what you all think.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Dr. Oberg. I wanted to give our panelists an opportunity to ask questions of each other. Those of you who have been listening, thank you for being here. If you would like to frame a question, you can please place it in the Q&A, and either you can unmute your microphone, or if you're feeling shy, I can read the question for you. But before we move there, any questions you have for each other, any from these wonderful presentations?
So, Michael, Dr. Oberg, I was interested, I had, well, I guess just to put the question straightforwardly, like, have you found any relationship like between like the position of Onondaga and like their, what do you say, like their possession of the salt economy, basically, in your documentation?
Yeah, salt's certainly important in the 17th, 18th century. That's what draws Europeans to the area for sure. What I kind of moved out of that though pretty quickly. And what struck me as really significant with Onondaga is sort of it's this hub in an information economy, right? The degree to which information was a commodity that could be bought and sold, traded, stolen, manipulated, and so much of the writing, let's say, for example, in the 18th century, focuses on William Johnson. Sir William Johnson, who had a long, really 4-decade career as the Crown Superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he cranked out so many letters, so many reports, so many documents that he dominates the historical narratives of the period. And Johnson Hall and his place in the Mohawk Valley, where he kindled his own council fire, really plays this dominant role. But I was never so glad when a historical figure I'm writing about died than when William Johnson died, because it just no more goddamn letters and trading inventories and all that. But it just seemed to me that he's relying on the Onondagas and I know there's Oneidas and all the other nations for this flow of information. And it seems to me that information, stories, rumors, lies, whatever, that this flow of information was in some ways of more value, not economic value, but just strategic value than any commodity cruising through the Mohawk Valley or along the shore of Lake Ontario. So salt, yeah, for sure, it's essential to the growth of Onondaga Lake. It's the reason why New York rushed in so quickly to drive the Onondagas away from the lake shore, because it wanted the salt. In a sense, it's still the bane of the Onondagas because there are direct connections with the salt industry and the pollution of Onondaga Lake and the destruction of Onondaga Creek, which is, in a sense, the pollution of the creek is a bigger story for the Onondagas than the lake, because the creek comes right through the homeland. But it's certainly important. It certainly generates a lot of documents for the first couple of decades of the 19th century. So in that sense, it's absolutely essential.
Thank you. I was just curious. I'd read just a little bit about it, and I don't know. Salt seemed like important back then. I was just trying to.
Yeah, it's your refrigerator. It's your for sure.
Yeah.
It's absolutely essential. Yeah.
I have a question for both of you, and I hope this will be interesting to the other SUNY folks on the call. I wonder if either of you have thoughts on both doing Haudenosaunee like scholarship in the traditional territories, but also within the context of New York State and its relationship with the Six Nations. Like Michael, you and I have talked about this a little bit, but like one of the things that my campus is experiencing is my Haudenosaunee students would like to have the Hiawatha flag flown and have the Thanksgiving address spoken at commencement, and the administration has been very resistant to that. So I don't know if either of you have thoughts on just like our place, our students' place.
Don't get me started. Yeah, I mean, I teach it again. My college is called Geneseo, right? And you can go back to the 17th and 18th century maps, and Geneseo is, it's important. It's a Seneca hub. It's critical, right? And I would argue, Maeve, that no college is more closely connected to New York's history of dispossession than Geneseo. The Ogden Company investors, their mansions are both ends of Main Street. We have Wadsworth Auditorium. We have Mary Jemison and Red Jacket dining halls. We're close to it, but yeah, our college is. Geneseo is where BIPOC becomes BPOC. They could not care less about Indigenous. They could not care less. I've asked them to go to the nation communities, recruit students. We have 3,600 students now. We had 5,600 in March of 2020. So we're in some ways we're in a lot of trouble. The answer was it's not worth the trouble. It's just not worth the trouble.
Response on exactly that issue here from student recruitment.
Yeah, and the flag they won't put it up. They offered a compromise to put it in a glass case in the student union, and I asked some folks from Tonawanda came by and said, "What's the deal with that?" It's just the long history of white people putting things significant or sacred Haudenosaunee people in glass boxes. That's not a great look, you know. So we are, and we arguably, I think our athletics department put up the worst territorial acknowledgement in the history of territorial acknowledgements. It thanked the Haudenosaunee for love of family and sports. So thank you. And and so we're really bad at it. And the administration has no interest in getting better at it.
Yeah, we had an attempt to put the Haudenosaunee flag up. The last thing I heard was that our local administration wasn't necessarily against it, but it seemed like it was a problem that was higher up than them.
It is officially against the rules in the SUNY guidebook, right, which specifies which flags can fly. You know, I was thinking, maybe when I first got to Geneseo in '98, I started working on the Grand Island land claim with I was working with Tonawanda Senecas, and the Chancellor King, a different Chancellor King back then, had sort of sent out a memo that this is in '98 or '99, no SUNY faculty was allowed to talk to any Haudenosaunee person. And Larry Hauptman, you know what happens when Larry Hauptman, I love Larry. When Larry gets upset, he writes an article about it and exposed what the chancellor was doing. My president at the time just tossed it. He thought it was stupid. How could I do my job if I can't talk to Haudenosaunee people? So he never gave this to me. I never knew about it at the time, but it does suggest how hostile SUNY has been to Indigenous people, to the study of Indigenous people over the year. I mean, what you guys are doing at Buffalo's great, Monty. I mean, that's really, but that's a recent development. It really is a recent development, how that's taken off. And it's been a lot of people who fought for lots of years, like going back to John Mohawk, to make that happen. And even that, John Mohawk was kind of the exception in the system, right? Because the rest of the schools have generally been pretty hostile.
For our panelists, Ryan Irwin had a question. I think maybe had to go pick up a little person from practice, which many may be doing right around now, which is fine. But I think takes us maybe from the state level to the transnational level, and with Ryan's question, which is, I'll just read his question and then please offer your thoughts. He said, I'd love to hear folks weigh in on whether they think Indigenous American history is having a moment. I'm thinking specifically about the mainstream appeal of some recent books like Hamalanen's Indigenous Continent and Ned Blackhawk's Rediscovery of America, but also the way this work has formed a lens to talk about the contemporary transnational relevance of settler colonialism. If yes, if you think we're having a moment, how would the speakers characterize the road to this moment? What are the implications and why now?
Brian's my colleague, so I'm just going to say that's really hard.
I've been at this long enough. Ryan was an undergraduate student in one of my classes at Geneseo when I was starting out. I think it certainly is. There's a lot of really sophisticated work coming out in general in Indigenous studies, and to me, it seems that this attention to a transnational focus comes simply from listening to what Haudenosaunee people are saying. You know, many of you are probably familiar with, going back to Akwesasne notes and something like that, which began publishing in the 1960s, I believe in the 1960s, right? Where that transnational focus is runs throughout the pages of Akwesasne notes. It's finally a matter of I think of non-Indigenous scholars, you know, and that would be me, paying attention to this stuff. It clearly was important in these communities. It's been ignored for so long. It's really just listening to what people are saying.
Yeah, I would also say, I mean, not to keep bringing this back to the SUNY system, but I think that it's very much like what Michael was saying, it kind of builds on one another. At Albany here, like I think that we're seeing the waves of the kind of revitalization work that Dr. Hill was describing. Like my students from Tuscarora and Seneca have come up having had language and culture in their entire like high school and like K-12 experience. And then they get here and they see like, oh, we don't have language classes like they do at Buffalo. Why is that? And they've been pushing our administration on that. And like they're thinking in this much bigger context, like they're carrying with them this foundation coming out of the kind of revitalization work that Monty described, and thinking about, you know, they're not necessarily aware of like Akwesasne notes, but like they've come up in this context and they are pushing that work forward. And I think that we're seeing kind of a similar thing with the kind of break into the mainstream of the visibility of the kind of Indigenous studies work of like, it's always been there. It's just now getting pushed further.
Yeah, when I look at what's been going on, so exactly what Dr. Oberg was saying. So we had people finally listening, and it's also been a matter of Haudenosaunee people basically just repeating ourselves, pretty much. You know, the messaging has been very consistent. And I think even with respect to like being willing to work with the SUNY system, like you look at the Everett report, you look before that, even in Handsome Lake and the Guy Wheel, they're talking about, hey, it's really important for our Haudenosaunee people to go get education, right? That is one of the huge things. And I think that really speaks also to like this respect and belief in a system that has mistreated us, has, you know, not kept up their promises and so on and so forth. But this idea is that we've made these particular agreements and we've made them in sincerity, and we hope that they will be carried out, right? And so the way to do that is to stay on message and say this is what we believe, and we believe the best in everybody is what's going on, right? There's like this sort of optimism.
I have so many more questions about sovereignty and transnationalism in the kind of in your work, but so feel free to continue to think about that and speak about it. But I had a question about something I noticed that the presentation shared, which goes back to a word that Monty used, which was the word flux. And a kind of sensitivity in all of your scholarship to cultural flux, to culture in motion, whether with language, sort of hybridity of language, the flux of thinking about material culture in Maeve's work, that clothing which seems frozen in place, in fact, is working with meaning in motion, and certainly network analysis has this quality as well. And in what Michael just said about information being a kind of key economy, a key commodity. So I guess my question for you is, do you feel like that, I guess it's a question about flux, is how do we think about flux within the deep knowledge of Haudenosaunee ways of thinking about history, and what's new about it as well in your scholarship in linguistics and history? How do we think about flux as historians and as linguists working with this material? What can we draw from about understandings of this concept from Indigenous knowledge, and where might you take it forward now working today?
Any you guys want to jump in?
Yeah, I actually have some thoughts about this. So I think about this, I'm like, well, you know, I will bring up like that 7 generation thinking again, right? And be like, well, okay, so right now okay, 2 generations ago, my grandmother was taken away from her family, right, to get the Haudenosaunee taken out of her. And now that didn't stop anyone or herself necessarily from transmitting our culture, the value, the importance of it. And this goes back to also like repeating ourselves, right? We want our people to be ourselves into the future. but also to be able to survive and also to be able to take care of ourselves. And that does require change. That it does require acknowledging the realities of the situation, right? And to be able to sort of adapt and understand the things that are happening for us to make the best decision, not only in the present, but for future generations. And I see myself as the beneficiary of one of these processes. And I also see myself also as like the beneficiary of like the goodwill of people that are out there listening to them. So I'm really thankful, even like, you know, we talk about the problems that SUNY has, but I'm able to support a lot of language work and everything that I'm doing now from my position. I'm able to step outside of my community, right? And I'm not pulling any of my community's resources to fund me in the work that I'm doing. There's room now for other people like Christian and other of these teachers to sort of step up and take up space in the community. So I think that's one of the decisions is leveraging these resources as best as we can.
Yeah, I think every once in a while a student will come into a room with a sense of what history is, and it's, you have to kind of educate them. It's not, history isn't the past, it's the study of continuity and change. And change is measured across time and space in people's institutions and cultures. And that change is fundamental to understanding history. And I think all of us, and certainly all of us historians, I don't know how much it affects you, Monty, but we all live with the shadow of William Fenton and kind of the Fentonite school, this old school of anthropologists. And Fenton's a complicated figure. He was a Seneca speaker. He's adopted Seneca, but he also had this method where essentially any practice, any cultural form that couldn't be traced back through time, up the stream of time to the earliest documents was corrupt, or I don't know. I mean, is maybe deviant, maybe, illegitimate in a certain way. And that whole school of anthropologists, it seems to me, and again, I realize Fenton's controversial, but I use his own words in the book, and I think they're very damning, is that he doesn't allow Indigenous people the right to change in the same way that Europeans have changed through this process. And when I interviewed people, one question I asked everyone was, how has it, again, if any number of people had their way, Onondaga will be gone. And yet they've survived. And every single person I spoke to emphasized the importance of still practicing ritual. They keep their ceremonies alive. And look, it's entirely, one woman I interviewed, Jeannie Shenandoah, she remembered being a kid and these buses of German tourists unloading on the reservation and people looking in windows, these tourists looking in the window and being amazed that Indians had television sets. And it just seems to me that it's, and I base this on talking to people for a long time, it's totally possible to, turn off the TV, pick up your cell phone, hop in the car, drive down the paved road to the Longhouse, and practice these ceremonies that have been practiced for 100 years, or hundreds and hundreds of years. And, you're still dancing to a very old beat. And the fact that you have a cell phone in your pocket and that you've got a Facebook page or a Twitter account or your, whatever the hell you got, it doesn't make it any less Indigenous. And I think, Fenton's been dead, 10 years, and there's still some of his adherents out there, but a lot of us appreciate that, I think, and certainly younger scholars appreciate that this change is part of history, right? It's fundamental to the story. No one wants to know what happened in one day in 1607 or whatever. We want to know what's changed over time, and that's where the work of the historian comes in. So it just seems to me that to go back to Ryan's question, that really is part of this moment, that we're tuned into how people change, whether it's looking at clothing or political pronouncements or language, and how the different Haudenosaunee languages kind of cross-pollinate with each other, and as they're rebuilt. I think all this is really exciting and interesting. And again, if large numbers of white people had their way, none of this would ever have occurred. There's this one, I'll give you one example. There's one woman in Onondaga I write about. She went to Carlisle. After she left Carlisle, she went to Casanova College, graduated, and she came home to Onondaga Nation, and she enters the news again like the 1920s, where this Seventh-day Adventist minister was hitting on her. He can't, her husband told him to take a hike. He came back when he was gone, and she was arrested because she threw a brick through the windshield of his car and was arraigned. And then, and when literally everyone from the nation went to the county courthouse in Syracuse, this guy decided it was better to just not pursue this case any further. But then in the 1950s, she wrote a letter. In 1957, she wrote a letter to the editor of the Syracuse paper, basically telling white people of Syracuse, get off our back, stop criticizing us. And again, she's a Carlisle student. She's writes beautifully. She describes her own devout Christianity, but she also describes that there are people practicing the old religion, right? The Handsome Lake religion, Kaiwio, that they have traditional people, they have dance troops, but they also have Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. They have a fire department. They have people who are, as she said, who need mercy and attention, but also people who are educated and doing great things. And then she sort of closes, goes, look, most of the trouble on the Onondaga Nation territory is caused by people coming here from Syracuse to drink and do whatever they want. And this letter was written in 1957. And it just strikes me, if Carlisle had worked the way it was supposed to, if these attempts to eradicate the culture had worked the way they were supposed to, that letter never would have been written. Mm-hmm. And it's just a stunning statement of change in the name of preserving nationhood. She went to Carlisle, she went to Casanova, she went to all these white institutions. She wrote English beautifully. I wish my students wrote English half as well as she did. And there she is in a paper telling Syracuse people, get off our backs because we are still here. And I think that's the flux, right? That's the change that makes this project for me so fascinating to work on.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to what a lot of our presentations touched on, of like, there's a very long history of the academic denial of Indigenous peoples' like fundamental humanity. And I think that you see that really strongly expressed in this tension around like who gets to change, whose culture gets to change, where there's this like fetishization of putting Indigenous people's cultures, nations in this glass box, and then they're never going to change. And that's a tool of colonialism, to be able to say that somebody is no longer Indigenous because they have a cell phone, because they have a car or whatever. It makes it easier to deny their nationhood. And I think with the scholarship around clothing, like, if you look at an American today and you see them, nobody wears a tricorn hat, nobody wears like the mantuas of the 18th century, but we're still American. And similarly, like all of our clothing is manufactured in Guatemala or Laos or Vietnam, et cetera. Nobody says that that's Vietnamese clothing, but scholars can look at the Indigenous clothing of the 17th and 18th century and say it's no longer Indigenous. It's just like the double standard and the impossibility to consider people's humanity and the change inherent in people's histories. I think there's a vested interest in keeping that because it's such a powerful tool of colonialism.
Yeah. Well said.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for these wonderful presentations about continuities and change and the dynamic between them, which strikes me as a really rich work, in some sense, bringing to the surface knowledge and understanding that's been around for generations, and in other ways, bringing new things to the scholarship and the ways that we can all try to understand and learn and participate in the knowledge of Indigenous culture in New York, and particularly among the Haudenosaunee. So I want to thank the three of you again for this wonderful session, for your time and for your scholarship. And remind everyone, if you're interested, our upcoming and final spring webinar in our series will be on June 6th, 4 to 6 p.m. Dr. Corey A. Graves from SUNY Albany will be presenting on her research about African Americans and abortion. Please feel free to register and join us then. We hope to be back in the fall as well, and hope you'll continue to join us in these conversations across campuses about history and historical inquiry. So thanks to all. Thanks again to our presenters, and hope to see you back here at the next webinar. Have a wonderful evening.
I just wanted to say that what Montgomery Hill said about the Tuscarora's language being dead at some point, there was some issue. I think that that statement reminded me of the Mark Twain quote about rumors of my death have been greatly exaggerated. And I think that you might insert Mark Twain's quote successfully in some the next time you discuss it to white folk.
It would be a great epigraph, yeah. Thank you.